You've all seen the ad on the television. Dustin Hoffman turns, looks straight into the camera with that silly grin, and he says, "Stories. We all tell them. About this, about that, about people. Some stories are so gripping that we'll go without sleep just to find out a little bit more. Some stories bring us laughter, sometimes tears, but isn't that what a great story does? It makes you feel. Mr. Toastmaster, Madam Assistant Toastmaster, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. If those words are true, if stories do grab us, if they can make us feel, why? When we need to be at our most persuasive, our most convincing, our most inspiring, do we sometimes pick them up and throw them out and replace them with logic, with data, with facts and figures? For me, stories, whether we're here in Toastmasters or whether we are anywhere else, are a speaker's best friend. And to prove that tonight, and I want you all to have a quick look at John Kelly, because the next sentence was just for him. To prove that tonight, I came here with no speech. How you doing, John? Has the panic set in yet? And the reason I did that is because what I'm going to do for the next few minutes is tell you some of the stories that I have collected over the last few years. Show you how I can use them to get across the points that I want to make in terms of how important stories are. And at the end, I'd encourage all of you to do the same if you're not already doing it. So work with me here for one moment. How many people here collect stories? Put your hand up. For those of you who don't, have a quick look around the room. Our ex-international president had a cup of coffee with me a couple of weeks ago. And in the course of the conversation, he told me that he has somewhere between 50 and 60 stories. And he has them because on occasions he arrives at a night like this, similar to this, and he's told, "You've 10 minutes to do," and he hasn't been given any prior warning. And what he does is he plucks out a story. And he plucks out a second story, he plucks out a third story, and before you know it, he's got half an hour of material. And I think this is a brilliant way to do it, because when you have stories that you can rely on, you don't have to worry about trying to remember the words on a page. And the great thing about the stories is that they make it much easier to remember the message you want to get across to the audience, the message you want your audience to take away with you. Let me give you a quick example. Last May 12 months, I was fortunate enough to speak at the conference that John Kelly made reference to back in Sligo. And in that speech, I told a story about my girlfriend as she was way back then, whose house I had called up to one Easter Saturday night with this beautiful Easter egg. Some of you have heard this story already. This beautiful Easter egg, she took it from me. She put it inside on the kitchen table and we went for a walk. And while we were out walking, ladies and gentlemen, she dumped me. Thank you, I do appreciate the support. You will be pleased to know that I got my revenge. It took me about 4 years, but I got my revenge. Would you like to know how I got my revenge? Yeah. I married the girl. Last Friday night, as some of you are aware, Castleknock Toastmasters celebrated 25 years in existence. They had this wonderful dinner. My wife and I were at the event, and I introduced her to a couple of people there, and they both started off by saying, "Catherine, can I ask you a question? Is that story about the Easter egg true?" 15 months after they'd heard it, and that was what they had remembered. Stories have this wonderful way of building credibility. If, for example, I want to persuade all of you right here and now that if you do things in a hurried, rushed sort of way, you're prone to making mistakes. Sounds like great advice, but how do I back it up? I back it up by telling you about Philip. Philip was in work one day 40 years ago, and he got a phone call to say that his wife had just given birth to their first child. He panicked. He left work. He ran to the shop. He bought a card. He bought flowers. He wrote the card. He went to the hospital. He went straight upstairs to the ward. He ran into his wife. He said, "Darling," he handed her the flowers. She looked at me and said, "Thanks very much." He handed her the card and she looked at it and she went, "Philip, why does the card say rest in peace?" Sometimes stories are just about connecting with the audience. My 9-year-old nephew, Sean, is sitting at the dinner table one day. And his mother is telling him about that terrible time when men could vote and women couldn't vote. You remember it, Ted, don't you? She turns to Sean and she says, "Sean, there was a group of women got together to address this terrible injustice. Do you know what they were called?" And he looks and says, "I do, ma. They were called prostitutes." I swear to God, you cannot make this stuff up. So what I do, ladies and gentlemen, is I collect stories. Sometimes the stories don't build people up. Sometimes they bring people down. John Kelly mentioned earlier that I played football when I was a good bit younger. I played for a team called St. Kevin's Boys, and one of the guys on our team was a guy called Nick. One Saturday afternoon, Nick had finished playing a match, and he went back to the local pub and he had a few drinks. And he got brave. And he decided he was going to drive home. And his best mates rowed with him and fought with him, and in the end, he won. He got into the car and he drove home. This is before the M1 motorway heading out past Swords, so he was on one of the A roads. Somewhere between Swords and Skerries, the car went off the road and went into a ditch. Thankfully, Mick got out. He was okay. He managed to clamber back up onto the hard shoulder. Took one step too far, and the truck ploughed him out of it. The power of stories, ladies and gentlemen. Now that I've told you that story, I better bring you right back up very, very quickly. My daughter Louise, she comes into the house one Saturday afternoon and she's fuming. And we said, "What's wrong with you?" She says, my gender said they have let me down immeasurably. I said, "What's wrong?" She said, "It's like this. Said I was on the bus coming home earlier on." He said, and there was two girls got on, and one of them goes, "Jacinta, look at me hair." I spend all day doing my hair, and I said, "The wind blows and it's ruined." And she says, "I know." She said, "I'm the very same. I think it's the tail end of that hurricane in Australia." Facts and figures cannot connect in the way that stories can connect. So let's go back again for a second. There's a handful of people here who collect stories, who have story files. The majority of you don't. I'd like to urge you to think about collecting stories. They're everywhere. Some of you come in tonight and something has happened, and it's a story that you could take away with you and use sometime in the future. A message that you can share with somebody. Will you consider doing this? Anybody? Yeah? About 5 years ago, I was working for a company in England, and I was sent over to Cincinnati to deliver a 25-minute presentation telling the company that I worked for, telling the company that we were going to see about the company I worked for. I was in Toastmasters a year. I had absolutely no experience in doing this. And the only way that I knew how to remember my story was to practice and rehearse and memorize every single word. I had a headache for a week, ladies and gentlemen. The interesting thing was, There were 5 presenters on the Saturday, and all of them, in their own different way, were uniquely bad. But created wonderful stories, and as a result of it, I came back from there, and about 2 weeks later I got a phone call saying, "We're stuck for a speaker, can you help?" And I wrote out an opening to a speech, a closing to a speech, and then I picked 3 of these guys' stories. And in order to remember it, I literally wrote down 1 line. That was it. The first guy, and if you can picture this, it was a Saturday morning. We'd been travelling most of the day before. When we got to the hotel, we were meeting people. We'd had a few drinks. We'd stayed up a little bit late. So first thing, 9 o'clock Saturday morning, we needed something with a bit of energy, a bit of enthusiasm, a bit of passion. We got Brad. Hello. My name's Brad. The second speaker, ladies and gentlemen, was no better. The second speaker was okay with vocal variety, but he was a guy who finished every single sentence by saying, "Okay," or "Alright." "How you doing? My name is Jeff." "Okay." "And I'm from the XYZ company." "Alright." Ladies and gentlemen, we had 45 minutes of that. Let me assure you, it was not okay, and it was not alright. Okay? The third speaker had no problems with vocal variety and no problems with crutch words. This was a guy who delivered his whole presentation wearing a full-length costume. Now in a moment I'm going to ask you to guess what he was dressed as, but here's your clue. The company he works for sell nuts for industry. What have they got him dressed as? Pardon, somebody said a squirrel? A squirrel, a 6'4" grey squirrel, complete with a bushy tail out the back. And ladies and gentlemen, it's a bit hard to focus on a message that's been delivered by a 6'4" rodent. I'm speaking now for a little over 10 minutes. And everything has been a story. And in one sense, each and every story has been totally unrelated. And this is evaluated. It won't be my best speech ever, Brian. Sure it won't. But the point I'm making is this. And in order to make the point, I deliberately came here tonight without a speech. So if stories can grip you, if they can make you laugh, if they can make you cry, if they can make you feel, and it can build a bond between you and your audience, doesn't it make sense to have a selection of stories that you can draw on every time you need to give a speech? I think stories are a speaker's best friend, and you can never have too many of them. Stories are to speakers what shoes are to Imelda Marcos. You can't have too many, and even though you may not get to use them all, it's good to know they're there if they're ever called upon. So ladies and gentlemen, that's my speech for this evening. I want you to think about the idea of collecting stories. It'll make it significantly easier when you have to pull a speech together to be able to pull out one line and know that there are the words you need to be able to put that speech together, rather than trying to memorise every single word. Like I haven't done tonight, Mr. Toastmaster.